Hi. It's now time for the third and final installment of my 45-45 league. I think it's season 12, end of season review, which, yeah, this video is pretty late, so I apologize for that. But, anyways, this is obviously the recap of the nominated game from board number 3. This is the game KJ Foster 17 versus W. Pruitt 14 from June 2nd, 2018. And we had a French in this game, so e4, e6, d4, d5. And here White played the move knight d2, which is the Tarrasch variation, which when I was clicking through this game, I was pretty happy to see, because this is the line I play with White. Basically, well, White's putting his knight on, I guess, a traditionally slightly less active square than c3, but he's definitely avoiding the highly sharpened theoretical and sort of irrational Winward variation. So you would make the argument, I guess, that knight d2 leads to sort of more normal, rational positions. Here Black played the move knight c6, which is known as the Guimard variation, which is far from being the main line, but it's been played a number of times. Gryzczuk is just looking at the list on the side here. Gryzczuk's played it, Nakamura's played it, even Kasparov played it. Anand also had a game here, if I remember correctly. It looks fairly anti-positional because one of Black's main ideas in the French is to attack White's center with the move c5, and this knight is ostensibly blocking that pawn. But Black does have some ideas behind this move. First of all, the pawn on d4 is definitely attacked. So White does have to react to that straight away. And if he plays knight f3, knight gf3, which wasn't played in the game, but this is the main line, knight f6, e5, knight fd7. Here Black's idea, he can no longer attack the pawn chain with c5, but his idea is to play f6. And if ef6, play queen takes f6, and then bring the bishop to d6, castle short, and possibly play e5 eventually, at which point he's got a lot of active counterplay. I think this line is supposed to be good for White, particularly I think if he plays knight b3 and answers f6 with bishop b5. Anyways, none of this was played in the game. After knight c6, White went for, I guess, the other try, which is c3, which is definitely playable, but I think it's supposed to be considered relatively harmless, theoretically speaking. Well, this move makes a lot of sense. It covers the d4 pawn, and if Black plays knight f6 like he was doing in the other variation, White goes e5, and after knight d7, for example, White still has the option of pushing his f-pawn to f4, which he didn't in the line where he put his king's knight on f3. And also, there's the idea, fairly typical for the French Tarrasch, is you put this knight on e2 rather than f3, so that the other knight can find a home on f3, and this is a fairly harmonious arrangement of the knights in these positions. But anyways, Black did not play knight f6 here. He played the main move, and illustrating another one of the points of knight c6 is the move e5. And if Black manages to get this break in, then Black's supposed to be doing pretty okay, because the center liquidates, and it's very difficult to speak of any sort of White advantage here. Here White played d takes e5. At some point in time, I tried to prove an advantage here for White, but I wasn't really very successful. I was looking mostly at the move e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight gf3, and after e d4, playing bishop c4, with some sort of position reminiscent of the c3 Sicilian. But I think my conclusion ended up being that Black was fine here. He can play either queen h5 or queen f5, and White doesn't really have much of anything. So yeah, instead in the game, White played d takes e5, which is also a move, and Black played d takes e4. It's also possible to play knight takes e5 when, after knight gf3, Black takes on f3. White can play both free captures, but in general, once again, the center is being liquidated, at which point it's sort of difficult for White to argue that he's better. So yeah, knight takes e5 is a fine alternative. Instead, black played d takes e4, which looks okay to me. I guess the point is if white plays knight takes e4, black trades queens and takes back on e5, and that ending um, doesn't look particularly attractive for white, especially considering probably white's going to have to spend another turn at some point. Well, it's moving his king somewhere, and king c2 might run into a bishop coming to this diagonal. So yeah, white understandably didn't want to go for that, and he played the move queen a4, which makes a good deal of sense. The knight on c6 is pinned, which is obviously important because black can no longer play knight takes e5 for the time being, and white's starting to play queen takes e4 when he's just a pawn up. And black has a couple moves here. I should mention the alternative here is queen e2. According to the database, when, yeah, black can play knight takes e5. If queen e4, he just has queen e7, and after knight e4, probably once again queen e7 to avoid anything bad happening on the e-file. And yeah, black's just totally okay. It's a symmetrical position. White's got the extra move c3, which doesn't really signify all that much. This is okay for black. But anyways, white played the move queen a4. And black played queen d5. Counterattacking the 5 pawn once again. The other move, which was played by actually a young Vishy Anand in 1990, is the move e3. Just basically with the idea of ditching this pawn to make white play f takes e3 and kind of rupture his structure, and with the argument that at that point, you know, black will have compensation because in the long run it might be difficult to hold both of these pawns. But anyways, black played queen d5. White played queen takes e4, heading for this endgame. If white wants to avoid an endgame, it's also possible to play f4 here. But after takes bishop d7, black is probably also fine. So white went for queen takes e4. Black played queen takes e5. Yeah, and here white played bishop b5. This is one of these weird. Well, normally it doesn't happen with queens, but you see this more often with pawns in the center. In the sense that neither side particularly wants to make the capture. It's obvious the queens are going to be exchanged in one way or another, but white doesn't want to be the one to take because then black's knight gets to go to the center, and equally, black doesn't particularly want to take for the same reason. Yeah, you see this more with pawn tension as opposed to queen tension, but I guess it's the same thing here. So that's why most people have played knight gf3 here, with the idea of making black take on e4, and then white gets to sort of activate their knight, and unblock the c1 bishop and so forth. White played a different move with a similar idea. He went bishop b5, pinning the knight, and compelling queen takes e4. This has also been seen in a few games. Knight takes e4, bishop f5. Basically, in this sort of position, white's, you know, got, I guess, a lead in development, but bishop f5 is coming with tempo. It's an open position, but, like, queens are off, so it's hard to say either side's king is really in danger. So it's mostly just sort of a position where neither side really has any obvious weaknesses to target. So it is fairly close to equal, if not dead equal. Black played bishop f5. White played knight g3. I wrote in my notes here, maybe at some point white should consider bishop takes c6. Which, I don't know. If I were white in something like this, I might just play this just out of sheer frustration for, like, you know, it's a position with no center and seemingly nothing obvious to do. So I might play bishop takes d6 just to argue that, okay, at least now you've got weaknesses. But on the other hand, like, it's not all that easy to target the pawn on c6. And it is relatively easy for black to defend this by means of like knight e7, castles, queenside, and king b7. And especially in the absence of a light square bishop, it's not easy to suggest a plan for white to target this pawn. Like, you can bring the knight to d4, for example, but what next? And in the meantime, black does get the bishop pair. White played knight g3, which I probably agree with. And black played bishop g6. In practice, black has also tried bishop d7. I guess the idea being that, well, black just wants to break this pin, and the idea of putting the bishop on f5 first before putting it back to d7 is to induce the move knight e4 to g3, thereby decentralizing the white knight. And in the future, we'll see this idea come up. I can't remember whether it occurred in the actual game, but black has the idea of playing h5, h4 at some moment, and subsequently arguing that the knight doesn't have anywhere great to go. And this is actually probably particularly the case after black's chosen move bishop g6, which is also fine, in the sense that particularly the e4 square is covered. Anyways, those h5, h4 considerations are still sort of relatively far away. White played knight f3, black played long castles. The one game from this position is Presenjit against Grover from 2010, and there black played bishop d6, which is probably also a fine move. White castle and black played knight e7. This is a very harmonious setup for black, and yeah, all the pieces are out. Bishops are fairly active. The knight on e6 covers the knight on c6. You probably don't even have to worry about bishop takes c6. But the problem, I guess, if there is one, is bishops are sort of vulnerable in the sense that, well, in the game white played knight h4, but that was met with bishop c2. But white has the idea of playing instead rook e1, with the idea of going knight e4 next, and it's not clear how black avoids giving up the bishop pair in this position. Even after giving up the bishop pair, like after knight e4 you can chop on e4, and after rook takes e4 you can castle either direction, and it's still, I think, very, very hard to argue that white has anything substantial, but this at least might give something for white to bite on. But anyway, after long castles, white castled, and black played bishop d6, which again, like as in the game, or as in the game fragment we just looked at, this looks very natural to me. The knight on g8 is potentially going to e7, where it supports the other knight. f6, sort of controlling this knight and preventing it from going forward anywhere, makes a lot of sense to me. The computer instead wants to play the move knight g e7 immediately, which looks a bit odd to me because, well, you're leaving the bishop on f8. But I mean, the argument is that, well, this knight will eventually go somewhere, and eventually the bishop will come out, and this in the long run won't be a problem. And it's not like while all this is happening, white really has all that much concrete to do. The computer's qualm reservation with bishop d6 is the plan rook e1. Well, okay, bishop e3 was played in the game, which is a natural move, but I don't think it's the most accurate. The computer's qualm with bishop d6 here is the move rook e1, with the same plan that I mentioned earlier, to play knight e4 and argue that he's caught one of the bishops. And after knight g e7, knight e4. I think we've come close to transposing into the game from earlier, but I think black's king might have been on the king side at the time. And here it's possible to chop on e4, but once again, this gives a tiny advantage because of the bishop pair. Instead, better arguably might be bishop h5, creating some sort of a counter threat. After knight takes d6 check, rook takes d6, for example, bishop f4, d5. And here, well, black is, I suppose, ready to double on the d file, but he's also, yeah, made a threat to this bishop. And there's also, of course, the idea in the air of playing bishop takes f3 and doubling the pawns, which obviously isn't the end of the world for white, because it's not like either of the doubled f pawns are immediately falling off the board, but it's inconvenient. and it's probably enough for black to get equality. And also, there's maybe the idea of playing rook f5 and creating some annoying threats along that file. So white might be best advised to play bishop e2. I think bishop c4 can be met with rook f5, right? Yeah, okay. And if the bishop moves, you can take on f3. Whoops. But okay, after bishop e2, yeah, white's got the two bishops, but his pieces are, yeah, kind of passively placed. And I guess you could still make the case white's a little bit better, but black should not be doing so badly. So you could make the case that scientifically, I guess it might be more accurate to play knight ge7 here to avoid having to give up the bishop at all, but human terms, it feels really dumb to make such a move. So black played bishop d6 and white played bishop e3, which again, you know, both sides are just developing their pieces. But concretely, rook e1 might have been a little bit of a better move. There's also the possibility, once again, to exchange on c6. And actually, after bishop c6, bc6, this is a really confusing position for me to evaluate because this sort of structure looked very familiar to me, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized this is an exchange Spanish. Essentially, it's an exchange Spanish where black's missing a b7 pawn and white's missing an e4 pawn. And perhaps slightly surprisingly, I think this trade-off favors black because, well, the queenside pawns aren't so much aren't really weaknesses, but without an e4 pawn, white doesn't have his sort of trademark 4-on-3 majority on the king side for the exchange Spanish. So it's much more difficult. White can't really create a pass pawn anywhere on the board so easily. And in the meantime, yeah, black has the bishop pair without having to worry about any white king side majority. So I think black, despite the broken appearance of these pawns, should be relatively comfortable here, even relative to an exchange Spanish. But anyways, white played bishop e3. Black played knight ge7. And I think, in my notes here, I just put the equal symbol here. I think I think the position is just dead equal around here. Because black's managed to get both of these bishops active, and white doesn't really have a chance anymore to take either of them so easily. And here white played a move which I don't think really helps his chances, but it's sort of hard to detect this unless you're running a computer on it. White played knight d4, which I don't think this is a great move. Like speaking in human terms, I don't think this is a great move, but it doesn't feel like the sort of move that should change the evaluation of the position. But around about here, the computer starts going from, okay, this is equal to, all right, black's kind of better now. And I guess the argument to be made, first of all, these knights are doing a pretty good job of protecting each other, but also in some sense they're kind of redundant because, well, they're protecting each other, but they're also, you know, kind of linked to each other, and they kind of get in each other's way. They're kind of redundant in a sense. And white, despite the fact that we sort of established earlier that bishop takes c6 is never really a great move for white, in some sense white has some kind of pressure here. So making the move knight d4 helps black exchange off one of his redundant knights, and eliminates any sort of pressure white might have had. In the sense that previously black always had to worry about bishop takes c6, even if white was never really planning it. But now that concern is sort of out of the way, and now black is free to try to gain some time off this bishop by playing a6 or c6, or something along those lines. And in the time being, I'm not sure it really accomplishes anything positive for white. Like, it brings the bishop to this diagonal. There's a threat against g7. Black can just play f6, and now this bishop is sort of blunted along this diagonal and not really achieving all that much. And in some sense, both of white's bishops are kind of aiming into thin air for the time being. Instead of knight d4, I think rook a d1 should probably be played, at which point black can play, for example, f6. And I mean, By the way, another point, like when this knight gets exchanged after this knight, black never has to worry about knight h4 anymore. And the position I think is just equal. But anyway, yeah, knight d4 was played. Knight takes d4, bishop takes d4 and f6. This is what happened in the game. And here, yeah, white played a slightly strange move. He played a4. Which I guess has the idea of, well, white doesn't really have any targets, and neither does black. So white is attempting to generate some sort of pawn storm on the queen side, which I guess in principle is a fairly reasonable idea, but it ends up, well, it's not exactly quote-unquote productive in the sense that the queenside attack is sort of a long way away, and also I guess you'd make the case that such a move would be better spent on bringing a rook to the open file in the center. It also ends up, I guess, being slightly weakening, because there's some lines I looked at where black's bishop is ending up sitting on b3, and that was kind of annoying. But anyway, a4 was played, and it's around this point black starts taking over the initiative. Black played a6. White played bishop c4. And yeah, another problem with the that I didn't mention earlier with the whole knight d4 exchanging the knights thing is not only can the e7 knight is it now free to go to c6, but also the bishop on d4 is a bit vulnerable because knight c6 actually attacks his bishop and might force white to lose another tempo in the process. Bishop e2 is also possible, I guess, with the idea of you might it might be beneficial to come around to one of these squares. Black can play knight d6, white goes bishop e3. And yeah, in general, black's probably a little better by this point, just by virtue of the fact that his pieces are a little bit more active, and I think the knight on c6 is somewhat stronger than the knight on c3, somewhat better placed, because the knight on c6 has a lot more options. Like the knight can go to e5, and then subsequently it can land either on d3 or, supported by bishop 7, it can land on the c4 square. From c4, the bishop on e3 and the pawn on b2 are both hit, and the knight on d3 is obviously generally quite a annoying piece, also putting pressure on the b2 pawn. Meanwhile, knight on g3, after what looks like quite a strong move, h5, doesn't really have all that much to do, because the argument is, first of all, the h5 square has been taken away from the knight. Also, black has stopped bishop g4 check followed by knight f5, and at some point, black might play h4, and then white's knight might be compelled to go somewhere weird. It's sort of important for black to time this h4 right, because if you do it with the king still on c8, you might be able to go bishop b4 check, king b8, and then 5. So you have to start with king b8 before going h4. Regardless, I think black's pieces are generally better placed than white's pieces in this position. So anyway, in the game, white went bishop c4 instead of bishop e2. C6 anyways, gaining time on the bishop. Here, white bishop e6 check. If white goes bishop e3, after knight e5, black's once again doing quite well. Bishop e6 check would reach something similar to the game, while after bishop e2, I guess this is an argument for going bishop e2 straight away, is that from c4, black is just invited to gain more time on it by the knight coming to e5. So I guess you could make the case that bishop e2 is a better move than bishop c4 for this reason. But anyways, after bishop e3, knight e5, if white goes bishop e2 back, after h5, black has an even better version of the thing we just discussed, because basically black just got the free tempo knight e5 in. And what this means is the knight, first of all, is one step closer to the d3 square or the c4 square, but also black is ready to play h4 next turn without any reservations, because white doesn't have this bishop e4 check idea, because the knight's already on e5 covering that square. So this is an even better version for black of the thing with that we looked at before. In the game, white went bishop e6 check, king b8, and then retreated, and black played rook h e8. So getting his last piece into play with a gain of tempo on the bishop. Well, okay, you could argue the rook was already in play on h8 if he was intending to go h5, h4. But anyways, in the traditional sense, at least, black is bringing his last piece into play with a gain of tempo, and black's pieces are all sort of beautifully coordinated at the point in time. I'd like to make them all orange. If black plays h5 at this particular moment, I don't think this is quite the right moment for it, because with this bishop on this diagonal, white can sort of extricate himself from the upcoming h4 related annoyances by playing bishop f5. But anyway, rook h8 is a fine move, centralizing the rook and attacking the bishop. White went bishop g4. There are other squares you could put this bishop, but there's not really an entirely ideal one. For example, like if you go to c4, then black's just invited to gain tempo on it with knight e5 or knight a5. If you play, I would like to make these both blue. You play bishop h3, that's kind of similar to bishop g4, but it's a bit more of a strange square. Sort of same thing goes. If you go bishop b3, you might be able to hit it with knight a5, or you might just play knight e5 or bishop d3 straight away. Bishop a2 is a bit of a weird move. And if bishop f5, importantly, black has the tactic bishop takes g3, removing the defender of the bishop on f5. And if white goes bishop takes g6, black now has the desperado of his choice, either bishop takes f2 check or bishop takes h2. Probably bishop takes f2 is slightly more accurate. When after, yeah, bishop takes f2, h takes g6. Black's just up a pawn. So anyways, in the game, white decided to retreat his bishop to g4, which looks like a reasonable choice as any to me. And here, black played the move knight e5, which is to be expected, gaining another tempo on this bishop while setting the knight on course for either d3 or c4. And here, yeah. Also possible is knight a5. And I mentioned the computer points this move out, and I mention it because while the knight is looking at c4 or b3, and I just wanted to point out the potentially non-trivial nature of the weakness of the b3 square created when white played a4 about 4 moves ago. But anyways, knight e5 is a fine move, and you can see sort of the amount of tempi black has gained off this bishop, and going all the way back, you know, it might have been worthwhile just to put the bishop on e2 straight away, because we can see it ended up going to c4 and to e6 to g4, and now it went back to e2. Admittedly, one of these moves did come with check, but black managed to play knight e5 and rook he8, both of which are very useful moves. And here, after bishop e2, black has some options. Knight d3 is a reasonable move and a fine one. Obviously, the knight is just generally quite annoying on this square, but also it creates a rather unpleasant threat towards the b2 pawn. If you try to defend it with a rook coming to b1, then yeah, you might have some issues along the h7, b1 diagonal. If you play b4, that weakens the c3 pawn, and probably black can just go bishop e5, and already it becomes quite difficult to cover the pawn, because the c1 square is covered and not presently accessible to a white rook. So probably the best white can do is just chop it, at which point after bishop takes d3, black's gained the bishop pair, and the bishop on d3 is also quite annoying indeed. And this position, I think, you know, it's sort of a solid equals over plus. Black has the bishop pair, and he can press for a little while. And not only does he have the bishop pair, but he's also got rooks that are already active along the open central files. And his structure is a little bit more, I guess, circumspect. White made the moves a4 and c3, which turn out to not be terribly ideal for the sake of the... Make these red? Nice. For the sake of the light squares on the queen side. Knight d3 was a fine move. Black decided to choose a different way of playing. He went bishop f7, which I think is also a good move, preparing knight c4. By the way, bishop d3 is probably also a reasonable move here. But okay, black went bishop f7, planning knight c4. If you could like make a case against the bishop f7 move, it would be that the bishop has sort of abandoned its post on g6, from which it was sort of dominating the knight on g3. Now the knight can potentially go to f5. But the thing about knight f5 is optically it looks nice. It hits the bishop, hits the g7 pawn. But after a simple move bishop f8, which outwardly looks a bit passive, but I mean, bishop in their starting square still observes a lot of squares. The knight on f5 isn't really doing that much. It doesn't really have. It's sort of firing blanks because the g7 pawn is covered and there's not that much else for it to do. And then next turn, black can probably continue as normal, play knight c4 or knight d3, depending on what white does. In the game, white played the move rook fb1, which looks a little bit strange to me, but we'll come back to that. I guess the quote-unquote normal move would be rook fd1. When after knight c4, once again, black's a little better. Once again, the bishop on e3 and the pawn on b2 are hit. And at some point, I should probably point out, you can't really preserve this bishop, or at least attempt to, with bishop c1, because black has the tactic bishop takes g3, removing the defender of the bishop on e2. So if you take back on g3, well, actually, if you take back on g3, if you take on e2, white takes on d8. So you have to take on d1 and take. Not only is black winning a piece, but he's also white's also all pinned up on the back rank. So and if bishop takes c4, sorry, if rook takes d8 check, rook takes d8, bishop takes c4. Just rook d1 check, bishop f1, and now bishop f4, and once again white's pinned up on the back rank. You don't even get to bail out by giving up the exchange, because it's going to be more than an exchange, because there's still this pin, bishop c4 upcoming, and black just mops up. So anyway, I just thought I'd show that when the knight comes to c4, it's not ever really possible to keep both of your bishops on the board with a move like bishop c1. As passive as it may be, white doesn't even get to get away with making a passive move like that. So you end up having to just chop on c4, and after black chops back, we get another one of these positions. Black's got the bishop pair, slightly better structure, active rooks, active bishops. White can probably still hold this, but it's not going to be terribly pleasant. And once again, knight f5 can be met just with bishop f8. Simple enough. Yeah, in the game, white played rook b1, I guess lending support to this pawn and showing that he still hasn't given up the prospects of creating play on the queen side with b4 and b5. I mean, it's an idea. So black went knight c4 as advertised. Once again, you can't try to keep this bishop with bishop c1. If bishop d4, black is c5, I think. And bishop d1 loses to bishop takes g3. If hg3, the defender of the e2 bishop's been removed, so black just takes on e2. And if bishop takes c4, black gives mate by, in some order, bringing both of his rooks to the first rank, and this will lead to mate in short order. So white is obligated to take on c4. Black takes back on c4. Again, we've got the stable advantage for black. Two bishops. The rooks are very nicely placed, and yeah, its rooks give off a little bit of a strange impression. Here, white played the move f5, which I mentioned before was a reasonable active move, but not all that effective. But actually, in this specific position, it turns out to be a blunder. Computer suggests white should play a5 or whatever. Maybe b4 is possible as well. But black actually now has a tactic due to the loose nature of this knight, the slightly strange white rook on b1, and also the weak white back rank. In the game, black played the move bishop f8, which, I mean, doesn't really spoil anything. Black maintains his solid advantage. But the move bishop d3 just wins an exchange for black. Because, well, it's a fork, first of all. If knight takes g7, black just goes rook e7, hitting the knight, and white should move his knight away, and then, sorry. And then black just picks up the exchange. He is in time to cover the f6 pawn. And yeah, should be doing well here. Perhaps black saw this bishop d3 move, but thought that it didn't work because of knight takes d6. But the problem for white is that after bishop takes b1, he can't actually take the rook on e8 because rook d1 is mate. And this is where the weak back rank comes in, and this is sort of the point of the bishop d3 move. And what's interesting, sort of, is that white never really had a chance to easily create luft to avoid this sort of tactic from happening, because h3, for example, always runs into bishop takes g3, f takes g3, and rook takes e3. So h3 has been hanging a piece, and so has f3. So it wasn't all that easy to create luft regardless, to even try to prepare this knight f5 idea. So bishop d3 would have won some material for black. Instead, he played the move bishop f8, which once again it maintains black's advantage, but obviously it's not as large as it could have been after bishop d3. But black's still doing well. White went knight d4, which sort of, I guess, is an illustration of the fact that once black goes bishop f8, the knight isn't all that effective on f5. White made the bishop back, but then couldn't really justify the knight being there any longer, so he went back. Black played c5, white went knight f3, and then black played d5. So just gaining some space on the king side. Potentially there's some ideas of playing g4, but that probably might allow this bishop to come to life. In general, black's sort of just gaining space, and the scope of the bishop on e3 ends up being rather limited when it's sort of blunted by both of these pawns. Black has the idea of playing, which he ended up playing in the game, of playing h6 and then play f5, f4. And harass this bishop. This bishop, yeah, is kind of lacking in squares. And the timing of g5 is probably particularly good here because white lacks bishop d4 to target this pawn, which has been newly undefended, and white also lacks the ability to land a piece on the f5 square. So white played the move b3. Possibly at some stage, white should consider playing the move h2, h4. Playing g4 might force the knight to go to some strange square, but it also probably doesn't do any favors for the health of this pawn conglomeration. Meanwhile, black can hold it together with h6, but the problem is now it's a lot more difficult to get f5, f4 in because the d5 pawn might just hang. Meanwhile, probably b4 is also possible here as well. And b4 feels like gives white a little bit of counterplay. So maybe at some point black is best advised to play a5 and clamp down on the b4 square in an attempt to prevent it from happening. Maybe. White played the move b3. Black played bishop b3. Advocates in favor of the move bishop f7. Maybe keeping the d3 square clear for a rook to go to target the c3 pawn, which has been really weakened. And the bishop from f7 might find itself on h5, where it can potentially annoy this knight. But okay, I find it hard to think that d3 is wrong. We went bishop rook b2, and around this point, his position gives off a bit of a strange impression. Very few of his pieces have much scope at this particular moment. And here black played the move h6, which once again has the idea of playing f5 and f4. Computer suggests that black play either bishop g6 or bishop e4, with the idea once again of putting the rook on the d3 square and targeting this pawn. And bishop e4, I guess, also serves the purpose of annoying this knight. The bishop from g6 might find itself once again on h5. And the problem is, like, you can't even really, the rooks are not on the same rank, so it's sort of difficult to oppose black's rook. Black can always just take it and then bring the other rook over. White's not in a position to recapture with his own rook. White might be best advised if black moves the bishop somewhere and then plays rook d3. It might be best advised to just defend this passively with a move like rook c1, which, to be fair, is actually relatively solid, but it is quite passive for white. Once again, I think a5 would be a decent idea to stop white from going b4 in. Okay, went h6 with a clear idea in mind of f5, f4. White played the move b4. It might also be advisable for me to play the move h4. Once again, just to stop the idea of pushing the f pawn. In which case, black should probably respond with a prophylactic move of his own a5. And, both sides are doing something to stop the other side's counterplay. And once again, black sort of maintains his advantage. With the bishop on e3, I think it makes a lot of sense to set up with these pawns here, put the bishop along this diagonal, and then set up the pawns on a5, c5, and b6 to put the bishop along the other diagonal. And then the bishop really doesn't have all that much to do. To be fair, it doesn't do terribly good favors for this bishop, but also this bishop a decent diagonal over here. Anyways, white played move b4, which, yeah, it's obviously not the end of the world for black that white gets b4 in, but it feels like maybe this should have been prevented. because it's not like black's in any great rush to play h6, so maybe it's worth taking a timeout just to play 5. But still, once again, black is still has a significant advantage even here. He takes before, he takes before, just feels like it makes a little bit more sense. F5 comes, but F4 is not threatening to trap the bishop or anything because it's got squares along this diagonal like here or here. Here white played move rook c1, which is now sort of a mistake, which black exploited with his next move. Computer wanted to go rook e1 or something. Once again, the position still looks fairly depressing for white. But at least, like to my eye, it looked slightly less depressing than it did a second ago. Whether this is justified or not, I don't know. But it feels like, I don't know, a rook might end up on the c file at some point, and this bishop has an open diagonal. But anyways, rook c1 in this particular position was a mistake, and black managed to exploit the positioning of these rooks with a5. And the point is, of course, if he pushes or takes, black has bishop a3 with a skewer. So the pawn on b4 just ends up falling. If you play the move bishop d2, well, then I can just pressure by playing rook e4. And once again, you still can't pressure take. White played the move bishop b6. I played rook c8. And once again, we see the issues with the back rank. And this is, I'm just realizing, this is another potential point of playing h4. Not only would it hold up the f5 advance, but it also would give luft. And the problem, of course, is after rook takes c8, back rook c8, you don't have time. You're no longer skewered along this diagonal, but you don't have time to pressure take because black's winning rook c1 with incoming mates. So white had to play h3. He didn't have to play specifically h3, but he had to spend a move to deal with the threat. Black took on b4. The computer suggests that maybe the most precise way to win would be rook c1 check, king h2, bishop d6 check, g3, and now bishop e4. And white, I think, sort of has to play something kind of undesirable to avoid losing the knight and getting mated. If you play, yeah, I mean, knight d1, I think, by the computer is best, but now, yeah, black plays a takes b4, and this knight is pinned up and stuck here forever, and black shouldn't have too many difficulties winning this. And if white plays the move b3, then I think it's the same sort of situation after black plays g4. You have to go knight g1, and then black plays a takes b4 or whatever. In the game, bishop takes b4 straight away. Both players were, as far as I know, relatively low on time around this point. I should mention for completeness and/or fairness' sake. Black took on b4. This is obviously still quite good for black. He's just a pawn up in the resulting ending. I guess you would probably make the case that if black is b4 right away instead of playing rook c1 check and bishop d6 check and bishop b4, maybe a take is a better capture because, I mean, you've got a passer. But okay, bishop takes b4 wasn't entirely unreasonable. We played knight e5, and here, courtesy of the computer, once again, the most accurate wins involve rook c1 check, king h2, and I think bishop d6, bishop b4 removes that one for black. Instead, he played the move bishop c2, which actually allows white a very nice idea to come back in the game, or at least make it tricky. Although, yeah, in fairness, both sides were running quite low on time about this point. But anyway, the problem with bishop c2 is that it creates this relatively sort of loose connection between the rook on c8 and the bishop on c2, which ordinarily wouldn't be such a large problem, but it turns out white has a very specific idea in mind that he can use to exploit this. So that's the move, and this is the only move that the computer doesn't assess as like minus 1.2 for black, is knight d7 check, king a8, and now bishop c5. And the point is, after bishop takes c5, white has rook takes c2. and this is pinned, and importantly, bishop takes f2 is answered by rook takes f2, and b6 is answered by knight takes b6 check when the therefore, black, and of course white's the connection between this and this, so white's just threatening to play rook takes d2, rook takes d2. So black has to counterattack the knight, he played rook d8, and now, yeah, if white takes on c2, black takes on d7, and take here and take here, black is doing well in this ending. Or if bishop takes b4, well, basically comes to the same thing, right? A takes b4 and so forth. So instead, white's idea was to play the move knight b6 check. Black played the move king b8. I guess low on time instinct is to not walk into a discovered check, and well, either he thought this was winning for white, or he forgot that his bishop was still hanging on c2. Either way, he went for king b8, which is unfortunate because he'd been better, basically move 15 onward, and was winning at various points. But now white gets to play rook takes c2, and unfortunately for black, but fortunately for white, white's now just up a piece, and he went on to win this game on move 79. Instead of king b8, black can actually play king a7. And the important point is that king a7, the king attacks the knight. So after rook takes c2, black can take on c5 and then take c6. I guess consensus to win this rook ending. While there aren't really any good discoveries. Like if you go somewhere random with the knight, black can take on c5. Sorry, in this position, if you go somewhere random with the knight, black can take on c5. If you play the double check, knight c8 check, you can actually just go king a6. And here, if white takes on c2, c8, actually white's even losing the piece because the thing is pinned to the other thing. If bishop takes b4, it doesn't have to play a takes b4 when rook takes c2 would win a piece, but he can instead play rook takes c8 and cover the bishop on c2. And okay, it's an opposite color bishop ending, but black has to take the pawn on a4, and he's a solid pawn up. I guess he should have good chances to win this because the pawns are connected. You can start pushing them very quickly, and they're supported by the king and the pieces and so forth. So yeah, like I said, unfortunately, black, fortunately for white, black played the move. Sorry, I should mention, after king a7, probably the best way I can do is to take on b4. And after well, you can't take on b6 because there's bishop e7 check, but you can play instead a takes b4 when after rook takes b4. For example, bishop e4. Black's not any material up at this point, but this bishop is quite strong, and white's conglomeration of pieces over here is kind of weird. So, and black's rook has the open file, and he can maybe make some trouble on the king side as well. So this ending is better for black, but the game hasn't been decided yet. But anyway, yeah, king a7 would have sort of maintained the assessment of black being better in the ending. And like I said, instead, unfortunately for him, he played king b8, takes c2, and then white was up a piece. And for completeness sake, I'll quickly click through the rest of this game. White managed to get the rooks off and then duly converted this to its eventual finish. And black resigned in this position. So yeah, that's it for me for the end of season reviews. I hope you enjoyed watching them, and hopefully I'll be able to do more of them at some point in the future, although given my track record of uploading these late, I don't expect that to happen. Goodbye, everyone.